Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. This story began quietly, like an incipient storm. It was early morning, the city was barely awakening, and an article appeared on a major news website with a bright headline like a cry for help, protectors or aggressors. What are police reports hiding? Local journalist Anna Tikomarova, already known for her stories about corruption and criminal connections in various government agencies, has taken on a new topic: the situation at the police station, where alarming complaints from black residents have been pouring in. Her latest publication tells of the torture, humiliation, intimidation that people were subjected to because of the color of their skin. The article includes accusations that were hard to imagine even in one's worst nightmares and testimonies from those who had gone through the fear and pain themselves. Behind every word one could feel the personal pain and unbearable fatigue of people deprived of justice. Anna began investigating 6 months ago when she was approached by an attorney for a young woman named Keisha Wilson. Keisha, a mother of two, described how she had been pulled over late one night for an allegedly non-functioning car light. She described that night with a chill in her eyes, how the police officer demanded she get out of the car. How, despite her calm demeanor, two patrol officers began shouting insults at her, accompanied by overtly racist remarks. Keisha was handcuffed in the back seat and taken to the station, where she had to spend the entire night in terrible conditions on a concrete floor. With no way to contact a lawyer or her family, she was released in the morning without any charges. Keisha kept quiet for 6 months, fearing retaliation. Her lawyer warned her that the police could always find a way to arrest her again. Anna knew that such stories were not isolated. Over the years, local activists had tried to draw attention to abuses and systemic discrimination, but each time this was met with a wall of official denials and refusals. The prosecutor's office stated that there was no corpus delicti in the actions of the employees, and human rights committees just spread their hands. The appeals went into the archives, and the evidence went into the trash. Anna realized that she was touching one of the most dangerous and complicated topics that had long been discussed in journalistic circles. She felt that if no one risked telling the truth, such incidents would only become more frequent. Her family, friends, and colleagues knew of her restless nature and her desire for justice, but few believed she could stand up to the state machine. However, the decision was made. Anna gathered information slowly, bit by bit, found people who hid their stories for fear of repercussions, and persuaded them to talk about their injuries publicly. This was a phrase that Anna often heard from lawyers she knew as she began work on her next article. On the one hand, these words inspired her to fight, but on the other hand, they seemed like a painful reminder of how the system is willing to protect its own, even when they go against the law. Anna realized that the only way to get a real investigation was to make the stories so loud that it couldn't be dismissed. She knew that threats and intimidation awaited her, that she might be risking not only her career but her life. Anna published the first article cautiously, deliberately avoiding specific names and persons to check their reaction. But what happened next exceeded her expectations. The news spread lightning fast, resonating with ordinary citizens, activists, and, of course, the police. The news and social media started a discussion that became a bright flash against the general silence. People who had experienced similar stories began to share their own cases in the comments to her articles. Things were heating up. Anna Tikomarova was not just a journalist, she became a symbol of fearlessness and intransigence. Her path was not easy, but every investigation, every expose strengthened her reputation as a person who was not afraid to go against the system. She knew that many people were afraid to get involved with law enforcement, with the prosecutor's office, with government agencies, but she never left a question unanswered, never let the facts be silenced. Her principle was simple: the truth was her only weapon, and she would use it even if she was alone against everyone. Anna was born in a small town where law enforcement was something sacred and unshakable. Anna's father, a former veteran, raised her to be patriotic and fair, but he also knew that sometimes the truth brought pain. He taught her to see and value independence of thought and honesty, no matter the cost. As a teenager, Anna saw how a close friend of her family was unfairly accused of a crime he didn't commit and how police officers deliberately misrepresented the facts to cover up the case. It was her first encounter with a system where justice depended not on the truth but on interests. Anna promised herself that she wouldn't let it happen if she had a chance to change things. That promise was deeply personal. She realized early on that most people, especially minorities, find themselves defenseless against the system and their stories disappear without a trace. Anna felt it was her duty to tell the stories of those who didn't have the opportunity to speak for themselves. Her career began with a job at a small independent newspaper, where she first managed to make a high-profile investigation into corruption in the local administration. This case became her springboard. Anna uncovered a scheme of bribes and illegal contracts that linked the mayor's office to criminal structures. Her article caused a huge public outcry, after which 2 officials resigned and the prosecutor's office had to conduct an audit to cover up the scandal. This victory inspired her to take new steps, but also made her an enemy of many power structures. Other investigations followed: environmental fraud, human rights violations in courts and prisons, financial scams. Anna became famous, and she began to be invited to work for larger publications. But as her fame grew, so did the threats. Someone left anonymous messages, someone called her at night, and sometimes she received letters insinuating that she had overstepped her bounds. Anna has paid a high price for her principles. Immersed in her work, she distanced herself from friends and destroyed several relationships, realizing that few could understand her obsession with fighting for justice. Her ex-husband often said she was living in a never-ending war with ghosts, alluding to her refusal to accept the obvious realities. But Anna saw no choice. For her, being a journalist meant defending people who had no voice. She knew that she and her stories were becoming a danger to the authorities, and with each new case it became more and more obvious that she would not back down. When Anna began gathering information about systematic racism in the police force, she encountered something darker than ever before. The people she met were afraid to even speak. Some came to meetings with their faces covered, whispering in her ear without raising their eyes. One of her sources, a former police officer fired for insubordination, hinted at a whole network of unofficial rules that operated within departments. He said that there were unspoken guidelines for detaining black citizens, often without cause, and about secret disciplinary lists maintained by order of superiors. Anna realized that this case could be the most difficult of her career. The entire police system could turn against her, which could devalue her work and make her the target of an investigation. But she couldn't say no. In every story of injustice, violence, and human rights abuses, she saw the very principles her father had taught her to stand for. The system turned the law into an instrument of repression, and those who tried to expose its ills into its enemies. As the moment of publication approached, the pressure on Anna intensified. One evening, she received an anonymous message on her cell phone demanding that she stop slandering the defenders of order. This was followed by a call in which a man with an authoritative voice warned her, "Your words could cost you everything. Think twice before you enter a war you won't win." But even such threats only fueled her resolve. Anna was ready to fight and was not afraid to openly declare her intention to continue the investigation. On the eve of the article's publication, Anna sent a draft to the editor. She realized that her story could lead to lawsuits and could ruin her career, but it didn't matter to her. The main goal was the truth. When the text was published, the backlash was even greater than she expected. The reaction of the police was lightning fast. The same day, the press office issued a statement accusing her of slander and attempted destabilization. From that moment on, Anna realized she was a target. The police began to conduct regular surveillance of her home. Anna noticed strange cars parked nearby. Her phone lines were clearly tapped, and on the street she was increasingly confronted with the disgruntled stares of the police, who watched her every move. Anna knew that an arrest was only a matter of time, but she didn't stop, and she wasn't going to stay silent. From the first days of her investigation, Anna felt that she was being watched closely. As soon as she started digging deeper into the story of racist violence by police officers, she was bombarded with a flood of random events and encounters that became more frightening by the day. At some point, her life became a game of survival in which the stakes were extremely high. One of the first signals was the constant surveillance of her house. Every morning when she went outside, she noticed a dark car with tinted windows parked nearby. It would stay there while Anna got into her car and drove away, and when she returned in the evening, the car was still there. Soon this began to happen every day. Anna would try to take pictures of the car to capture the license plate number, but as soon as she lifted her phone, the driver would drive away. Not a week later, She started receiving calls from unknown numbers. Sometimes there was silence, sometimes heavy breathing. A few times she was texted with short messages like, "Stop it, think about what you're doing, you're in for a nasty surprise." She realized that these were more than just warnings, they were outright threats. However, Anna could not allow herself to be intimidated. Each threat only strengthened her confidence that she was on the right path. Anna's superiors soon came to the point of threatening her. The editor of the newspaper where she worked was visibly nervous when he informed her about the visit of two men in suits who introduced themselves as representatives of the city police. They were supposedly interested in her articles and decided to socialize, as they put it, as part of an ongoing investigation. The editor recounted their conversation in a shaky voice, as the men clearly made no secret of their displeasure with her publications. One of them asked the editor, "Are you sure you want to be among those who fund this kind of material?" This was followed by a phrase that caused an icy silence in the newsroom. "We'll be watching her every word." From that moment on, Anna realized that she was facing something far more dangerous than mere discontent. She felt herself alone against an entire apparatus in which every will was ready to destroy her as she continued her revelations. It soon became obvious that the police had decided to up the ante. One morning Anna found an envelope on her doorstep with no return address. Inside was a photograph of her younger brother, taken in a clearly threatening manner. He was walking down the street, followed by a car. It was the same car that parked outside her house in the mornings. Her brother never interfered in her affairs. He was far from journalism and had nothing to do with her work. He was just a member of the family, someone she loved and cared for his safety. But now it was clear that her private life had become part of their game. Anna went to her lawyer and told him about all the strange things going on around her. He advised her to be cautious and to be on the safe side in case of possible arrest. The lawyer spoke seriously. "You know these cases don't go away. They can fabricate anything from fake evidence to false testimony." A few days passed, and the lawyer was right. The police searched her apartment on the basis of an anonymous report about Anna's possible involvement in financial crimes. Finding nothing, they tried to fabricate evidence, but the lawyer intervened in time, forcing the police to leave her apartment alone. This case confirmed, they are ready to use all means to discredit her and her investigation. With each new day, Anna felt more and more alone. Her friends and acquaintances tried to avoid socializing. Her work was becoming too dangerous. Colleagues who had once supported her now averted their eyes warily when she entered the newsroom, unwilling to get involved in her fight against the system. Her editor once, behind closed doors, said pleadingly, "Anna, maybe you should stop. You don't realize what you're dealing with." She only shrugged, but anger was boiling up inside her. How can you stop when you know the truth and see the injustice? One evening Anna received a call from a man who introduced himself as an intermediary of an influential person. He offered her a large sum of money in exchange for her silence. "Understand," he said, "we are ready for dialogue. No one wants this mudslinging. Perhaps we can arrange for you to switch to other topics. Just think about it." The offer seemed like a way out, a way to get rid of fear and find safety. But Anna refused, realizing that if she agreed, all her work, her principles, would be betrayed. After her refusal, the pressure mounted. The police launched a real campaign against Anna. Local news began to publish articles full of insinuations about her alleged illegal activities, accusing her of having links with criminal structures and claiming that her articles were paid for by unknown radical organizations. On social media, she has been slathered with mud, claiming that she harms the security of the country and undermines trust in justice. These accusations, though false, fueled the hatred against her. Her phone was bombarded with messages calling her a traitor, and anonymous threats appeared periodically in her inbox. Last warning, one night when Anna was returning home, on the way to her house she saw that the door to her apartment was ajar. Inside it was a mess. Her belongings were scattered. Her documents and photos were torn. On the table was a note, "This is your last warning. Stop before it's too late." Anna realized that she was left with no choice. If she continued, she would jeopardize her life and the safety of her loved ones. She was intimidated, bribed, vilified, but Anna still stood her ground. She had already gone beyond the point of no return, and now there was only one road left: forward, to the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. Each new testimony, each story of violence and humiliation added to Anna's strength, but also weighed heavily on her soul. She knew that this path was not for the weak. and she realized that she had no right to give up. The people who took the risk of telling her their stories confided in her their most intimate things, their fear, their pain, their rage at being powerless in the face of a system that was supposed to protect them. These people had nowhere else to turn but to her. Their truth now rested on her shoulders, and she had only one choice: make it known. Her first and most trusted source was Keisha Wilson, a young mother whose life was shattered by one seemingly simple incident. The night she was pulled over, she was coming home from her evening shift, tired, dreaming of nothing more than seeing her children, but the police decided otherwise. They searched her on the spot, forcibly removed her from the car, and then took her to the station, where she spent the night in solitary confinement, handcuffed. Her cries and pleas were met only with crude taunts. Keisha recalled hearing words like "no better than you" and "you always stink" of fear from the officers. As Anna wrote this, her hands shook with anger. She knew that Keisha was not the only victim. The accounts of these incidents were similar, as if written from the same script. It was a typical, hidden policy: if you were different, you could be humiliated and intimidated. One of the most important steps was to meet David Hudson, an experienced human rights activist who had worked with police abuse cases for many years. Hudson was well aware that Anna could be the next victim in this dangerous game, but he saw her determination and was willing to provide help. It was he who revealed to Anna a whole array of documents, complaints left on file, denials of cases, applications made by black citizens and never processed. Hudson showed her records of interrogations where the victims' words were deliberately distorted to make them look unfavorable. "It's a huge, closed system," Hudson said at one of the meetings. "They defend themselves from within as soon as someone tries to disrupt their order. On the outside, it's just honest people in uniform, but in reality it's a community where everyone covers for everyone else. Everyone here knows about the problem, but they keep quiet." For Anna, his words were a revelation, but not a shock. She had already seen how this mechanism worked, but now she had specifics, concrete names, and documents to back up each accusation. Realizing that the police were willing to do anything to stop her, Anna was forced to meet people in strict secrecy. She set up meetings in dark parking lots, in cafes on the outskirts of the city where their conversations could go unnoticed. One of her sources was a former police officer named Marcus, who had left the force after refusing to participate in covering up evidence in an illegal detention case. He described the unspoken rules that existed in police departments. These rules included unspoken orders to detain black men and women for any slightest suspicious reason, to use harsh measures against them, and to write up reports in such a way as to make the charges appear justified. "You have no idea what they do to those they consider a threat," Marcus said quietly, looking away as if he was afraid of being overheard. "They abuse them, taking their phones, disabling their cameras. Those who go against this system are targets. I tried to fight, but all my complaints were simply erased." His story made Anna remember the case of Andrew Martin, a college student who was arrested for allegedly stealing a wallet. In fact, the wallet was lost, and when it was found, no policeman even apologized to him. Andrew told Anna how he was interrogated all night, humiliated and insulted, forced to confess to a crime he had not committed. It was not until the next morning, when his mother stormed the station with his lawyer, that he was released. This case, which became a landmark for Anna, confirmed that the legal system simply did not exist for certain people. She met people with fear on their faces and pain in their eyes. They shared their stories, realizing they had little chance of seeing justice. One victim, Jennifer Waits, told how she was detained for trying to protect her brother from being detained. She was thrown into a cell where she was held for 3 days without being allowed to contact a lawyer. One day, an officer came to her and hurled racial slurs at her, and then told her to learn her lesson. Anna remembered every story. In her notebook she kept all the names, dates, addresses, details of what had happened to these people. With each new story, her resolve only grew stronger. When Anna tried to record interviews, her sources were harassed and some were even detained. Keisha told her that after talking to a journalist, she was summoned for interrogation at the police department, where she was urged not to communicate with lying media. One source even disappeared after handing over valuable documents to Anna. These events showed her how far the authorities were willing to go to hide the truth. Anna realized that she was walking on thin ice. Now she saw that she wasn't just fighting specific police officers. She was facing a system that was ready to destroy anyone who dared to expose it for its own protection. The most gruesome to her were the stories of beatings that left no trace. The police were masters of violence without evidence. They beat detainees in the legs and ribs, so that the injuries would not be visible on superficial inspection. One of the young men, whom Anna met on Hudson's advice, showed her a hidden camera that captured him being beaten by 3 officers in the station's underground parking lot. It was a silent scene of violence, shocking and frightening in its cold brutality. These stories made her unbearably furious, but she also realized that she was walking on the edge, and every step she took brought her closer to the dangerous edge, beyond which was not just a threat, it could destroy her. Anna was ready to fight, realizing that the truth was the only thing she had left. Anna's article was published in the early hours of Monday morning, and by midday the city was already seething with anger and bewilderment. The article, titled "The Dark Truth in Blue," was published on the most popular media platforms and was accompanied by the subtitle, "Linking Violence and Racism in the Police System, Evidence That Cannot Be Ignored." The article revealed details that could not be denied or withheld. The photos of victims, witness statements, details of court complaints, and arrest records shown in the article seemed to come alive on the pages of the publication, revealing the brutality of the system that was supposed to protect. By late afternoon, thousands of people had filled social media with angry comments. Videos of interviews with the victims, Keisha Wilson, Andrew Martin and others, went viral on the internet, their faces contorted with pain and suffering. Their stories of nights in cells where they were threatened and humiliated became mainstream news topics. People began forwarding the article to each other, leaving hundreds of comments under the posts about the need for reform. For many, this article was something of a painful awakening. It turned out that many citizens had no idea how deep the shadow of racism and violence had penetrated their city. For a long time, human rights activists had been speaking out about the abuses, but their voices had been quiet and unnoticed. Anna, on the other hand, filed the story so loudly and openly that no one could pretend it was just a rumor. Stories of black people being beaten and humiliated by the police made the front pages of newspapers and television screens, and videos of the victims gained hundreds of thousands of views in a matter of hours. By evening, protests had begun in the city center. People carrying banners calling for justice filled the central squares. Groups of activists armed with banners reading "No to Racism and the Police, Justice for All, Voices of Victims Must Be Heard" marched towards police stations. They demanded answers and immediate action. With each passing hour, the protests spread to more and more neighborhoods, and by midnight, thousands of people were already participating. This publication became a symbol of unification. People of all ages, professions and backgrounds took to the streets. The crowd included students, doctors, teachers, and ordinary workers. They came to support the victims, but also to express their solidarity with Anna, who, despite all the threats, managed to tell the truth. Social media exploded with support for Anna. She was called a heroine, a person who risked her life for justice. The feeds were full of appreciative comments and calls to protect her from the police who clearly wanted to eliminate her. Many spoke of Anna becoming a voice for those who had been forced into silence. People sent her messages offering her help and support. Her colleagues across the country began to speak out publicly in her defense, calling for the protection of press freedom. The response among black communities was particularly powerful. Meetings were held in churches and community centers to discuss the article, talk about the need for change and solidarity with Anna. One speaker, the senior minister of a local church, said, "This woman risked everything for us. She has shown us that we are not alone. Now it's our turn to stand with her." These words spread across the internet, symbolizing a new wave of resistance against violence and injustice. The reaction of the authorities was mixed. Police representatives first tried to justify themselves by saying that the article was based on unproven allegations. However, when they saw the strong public response, they realized that mere denial would not be enough. The next day, an emergency meeting was organized in the city hall. The head of the city, speaking to the press, said that he was seriously concerned about the information presented and intended to conduct an internal investigation. However, there was no real regret or desire to change anything in his words or tone. This only made the protesters even angrier. On the same day, several police unions issued an official statement accusing Anna of undermining confidence in law enforcement. They called her investigation an attempt to destabilize the city and a dangerous precedent for journalists. But such statements only served to strengthen citizens' resolve. As the protests gained momentum, journalists across the country began writing about Anna's investigation, sharing her story and expressing support for her. Many newspapers and TV stations held meetings in her defense. On Twitter and other platforms, the hashtag Justice for Anna was launched and gained popularity. Even those who had not previously dealt with the topic of police abuse began to publish stories about racism in law enforcement agencies in their cities, showing that the problem was far from localized. Many journalists feared that after the publication of the article Anna would be in serious danger. They publicly stated that they would follow her fate and do everything possible to protect her. The public, seeing the support of Anna's colleagues, only became more convinced of the need for change. As a result, Anna's investigation became more than just an article, it became a movement. But soon after the first days of mass publicity, Anna began to receive real threats. One night, as she was returning home after a long day at work, she was attacked by two men in dark hoods. They rudely pushed her away and pushed her against a wall, telling her that the last chance to retract the article was gone. One of her attackers leaned toward her and whispered coldly, "You know what will happen if you continue." Then they quickly disappeared into the darkness, leaving Anna in a state of shock. Anna went to the police, but her statement was simply ignored. No one returned her call, and no one came to listen to her. It was as if the police were trying to make it clear that they were not going to help her. Moreover, her involvement in this investigation had already cost her reputation, and now it might cost her life. But when the case became public knowledge, the tide of anger rose again. People started posting videos demanding that those responsible be held accountable and that the journalist be immediately protected. This incident of assault was the spark that fanned the flames of protest even further. People demanded answers from the authorities, called for the dismissal of the officers Anna had written about, and insisted on a complete reform of the entire system. Large rallies began to be organized in the city. The main streets were filled with protesters, and signs were raised among the crowds reading, "We see you. For truth for Anna. Enough of lies and violence." Anna continued to fight, inspired by the way people came to her defense. She knew that her life could be in danger, but felt that to remain silent would be a betrayal of both the victims and herself. After Anna's article had an explosive effect and sparked a storm of protest, the police department did not stand idly by. At first they tried to ignore the wave of discontent, believing that the public anger would soon subside. But when they realized that Anna was not going to stop, they launched a counter-plan to launch a media campaign to discredit her. The power of the system was on the side of the police, and they were ready to use the whole arsenal to devalue her work, make her look like a liar, and stop this exposure. The day after another wave of protests, the police chief spoke at a press conference where he expressed deep concern that unverified information from the journalist was damaging the reputation of police officers whose job was supposedly to protect citizens. The police chief's serious face and impeccable suit gave the illusion of authority and integrity. These so-called testimonies are nothing but speculations and exaggerations that destroy trust between the public and law enforcement agencies, he declared, looking directly into the camera lenses. He was followed by several exemplary officers who spoke about their work, emphasizing that every day they risk their lives for the safety of the public and that Anna's publication allegedly insulted their honest work. A tearful speech by a young officer who told how he had rescued children from a burning house and was now facing unjust accusations silenced the press for a while. These stories were calculated to elicit public sympathy and question the objectivity of Anna's investigation. The police and their supporters began to actively spread rumors about Anna's personal life. Questionable posts appeared on social networks that she had allegedly been repeatedly prosecuted for slander and spreading false information. A whole network of anonymous accounts was created that wrote that her journalistic career was built on scandals and provocations. These false reports were accompanied by fake evidence, distorted photos, fake copies of complaints against her, and screenshots of non-existent articles accusing her of journalistic malpractice. False testimonies of people allegedly affected by her interference also appeared online. One such fake witness claimed that Anna had made up an article about his case several years ago, distorting the facts and ruining his reputation. These comments spread rapidly and were massively liked, raising doubts among a less knowledgeable audience. Higher authorities also intervened in the case. Anna was summoned for interrogation in connection with her article, where the investigator asked her many provocative questions, trying to catch alleged inconsistencies in her story. She was warned that she could be charged with libel if she could not prove every word she said. Moreover, She was threatened with criminal proceedings for undermining the reputation of law enforcement agencies, which in legal terms could cost her a huge fine or even imprisonment. Every meeting with representatives of law enforcement agencies turned into a psychological battle for Anna. The investigators insinuated that she had a choice: withdraw her article, publicly declare that it was a mistake, and avoid punishment. They pressed her weaknesses, threatening that such a case could tarnish her career for a long time, that she would no longer be accepted by any editorial board, and that she should stop now, while she had the chance. But instead of giving in to threats, Anna decided to go further and reveal a new layer to her investigation. She knew that the only way to preserve her reputation and the truth was to release even more evidence. Anna called an emergency press conference where she presented another piece of her work with a determined look. She displayed copies of official complaints, videos of abuse, and new interviews with victims willing to testify in front of reporters. "I will not recant," she said, her voice ringing with determination. "The truth is the truth, and if anyone thinks they can silence it with threats and pressure, they are sorely mistaken." She knew there would be consequences for her action, but she saw the fire and determination in the eyes of the journalists gathered at the press conference. Her colleagues were ready to support her. Many of them published their own articles about the pressure Anna had been under. In response, the police launched new rumors and accusations, but now they were less convincing. Anna had support. It was early in the morning. Anna was still asleep when a heavy, insistent knock sounded on her door, jolting her out of her sleep. Half asleep and dazed, she went to the door and heard an authoritative voice: "Anna Larson, police." "Open the door." Anna's heart sank. She realized at once that this was not just a test. It was the moment she had known and mentally prepared for all along. She opened the door, and a group of officers in full gear stood before her. Their faces were closed, their eyes cold and detached. The team leader read the charges to her, formally and without emotion, as if they were some minor offense rather than something that involved her life and liberty. "Anna Larson, you are charged with spreading false information, undermining state security, and resisting the authorities," the officer said in an even tone, as if he were reading from a textbook. Her attempts to explain and protest that she was just doing her journalistic duty went unanswered. One of the officers grabbed her arm roughly, snapping it back, and snapped the handcuffs sharply. Anna felt pain and a sharp sense of helplessness at the same time. She tried to maintain her dignity without giving in to despair, but she was scared. She realized that she was on the receiving end of the vengeance of the entire system she was up against. On the way to the station, the charges were read to her, each one sounding more and more absurd: undermining state security, for an article exposing police abuse; defamation, for interviewing victims who had endured humiliation and brutality. Anna knew that her material had been vetted, that every word in her article was true, but the police chose a different path, the path of demonstrative punishment to intimidate anyone who dared to criticize them. The accusations were accompanied by scathing statements by official structures. News reports described her as a dangerous extremist, a troublemaker, and a person who deliberately undermined the stability of the state. Her investigation was called a false campaign to denigrate the rule of law, and she was described as an agent of chaos. The Ministry of Interior issued an official statement claiming that she was stirring up ethnic discord and setting dangerous precedents for disobedience to the law. Anna was placed in a small, dark, windowless cell, where a lone lamp flickered in a faint, cold glow. The cell was damp, the walls radiated cold, and the smell of mold and dampness was so acrid it took your breath away. On the floor was an iron bunk without a mattress, bolted to the wall, and an old, rusty wash basin. Once inside this space, Anna felt the fear creep deeper into her. The words of support from friends and colleagues seemed so distant now. The first days were particularly difficult for her. The officers changed every few hours, and each new interrogation became an ordeal. They deliberately asked the same questions over and over again, intending to break her morally, to make her confess to crimes she had not committed. They tried to intimidate her, saying that she would face a harsh sentence, that she would never see her friends or family again if she did not cooperate. The food that was brought to her was barely edible, cold and poorly cooked. The portions were minimal, and after a few days Anna began to notice that her strength was melting away. There were no blankets in the cell and the nights seemed endless. The cold was so intense that she began to shiver to the point of exhaustion, falling asleep for only a few minutes and immediately waking up from the cold. Time lost its meaning. The days merged into one long, endless moment, full of pain and despair. Each interrogation took place in a dark room with dim light, where an officer sat behind a desk with an expression of contempt on his face. Their purpose was clear. They wanted Anna to plead guilty, to retract her article and admit that she was wrong, but she persevered. Despite her pain and fatigue, she knew that her words mattered and that her confession would be used against others, against victims who had already gone through such a painful ordeal. One day, during another interrogation, one of the officers, bending over her, whispered with a cold laugh, "Do you think anyone will help you? All those who supported you have already forgotten. You're a nobody. You're all alone here." Those words were like a dagger stabbed into her heart, but Anna realized it was part of the plan, part of their game to break her spirit. Sometimes they would slip her documents and make her sign confessions of slander and spreading false information. They convinced her that just one signature and she would be released, but each time Anna returned the papers, refusing to compromise, she knew that if she signed the confession, all her hard work, all her risk would be in vain. She would remain one of those who had succumbed to the system, who had lost. In the moments when she was alone, Anna began making small, almost imperceptible inscriptions on the walls of the cell, scratching out short words and phrases so she wouldn't forget who she was. Her hands were covered in scratches, but every time she saw those words, her spirit was strengthened. She wrote phrases like "Truth is more important than fear," "I am not alone," and "The voices of the victims are my strength." These words became her inner core that helped her hold on despite the physical and mental torment. Meanwhile, on the outside, the news of Anna's arrest sparked a new wave of protests. Citizens took to the streets with placards demanding her release, and the hashtag #FreedomAnna was spread in social networks. Human rights activists and journalists began organizing rallies in front of the police and the judiciary, demanding a fair trial and dismissal of charges. But the police did not back down. They claimed that Anna's actions were aimed at inciting unrest and that they were restraining her to preserve calm in the city. Her colleagues and friends did not give up. Recording videos of her strength and perseverance, they urged citizens to keep fighting, to not let the system silence her. "If we let the authorities deal with Anna, tomorrow they will deal with us," one of her colleagues said, standing at a podium in front of thousands of protesters. Anna continued to fight in her cold confinement, not knowing how much more she could take, but knowing that she was no longer alone in this battle. Soon after Anna's arrest, a trial began that attracted national attention. Her lawyers, despite restrictions and obstacles, had one goal: to fight for her freedom and to prove that the charges against her were false and politically motivated. The charges brought by the police bordered on the absurd: defamation, extremism, spreading false information, undermining state security. The lawyers realized that behind these buzzwords, the authorities were trying to set a precedent and shut up those who sought to speak the truth. The trial began with the prosecution's insistence that Anna had allegedly deliberately incited hatred and attempted to undermine the foundations of the state. The prosecutor gave an emotional performance, denouncing her as a dangerous element who was willing to undermine peace and tranquility for the sake of her ambitions. His words were filled with official terms, but to those familiar with Anna's work, they sounded hollow and false. Every prosecution argument was built on facts taken out of context, and Anna's lawyers sought to expose them at every stage of the trial. The defense presented evidence that her articles were based on verified facts, interviews with real victims, and that her only goal was to expose the truth about systemic abuse. In the courtroom, Anna held her composure despite the pressure. Her presence inspired confidence not only in the defense team, but also in everyone who watched the trial. She refused to plead guilty to telling the truth, even when offered a lighter sentence in exchange for her confession. At the same time, support was building outside the courtroom. Social networks were swept by a wave of outrage. People posted under the hashtag #FreedomAnna, shared her articles, posted videos and photos from the protests. Young people, activists, and media representatives all rallied in her support. Rallies were held in many cities, where thousands of people held placards with her name and calls for justice. People chanted slogans demanding a fair trial and expressed outrage at police brutality. Every day a crowd gathered in front of the courthouse. People came from other cities to support her and show that they were on the side of truth. Reports from the scene began to be broadcast live on all major news channels. A massive public debate began. Can we trust a system that protects uniformed criminals and punishes those who try to denounce them? Petitions demanding Anna's release gathered tens of thousands of signatures. Even some high-ranking officials began to speak out cautiously in support of her, feeling that the wave of popular anger could turn against them. The situation with Anna began to attract attention not only within the country, but also abroad. Well-known human rights activists, writers, journalists and actors from different countries spoke out in support of her. Authoritative international human rights organizations demanded a fair trial and an immediate end to political pressure on her. Newspapers and TV channels from Europe and America began to publish articles highlighting her case as an example of fighting injustice and suppression of freedom of speech. Some of the influential human rights defenders launched campaigns in support of Anna, calling on the authorities to reconsider the charges. These campaigns became major events. They included press conferences, meetings with representatives of international governmental organizations, and mass solidarity actions. Official letters from international organizations began to arrive at the court and the government demanding explanations as to why the journalist had been arrested and tried for her work. In the meantime, the judges and lawyers defending Anna began to come under pressure from different sides. They received threats, suspicious letters and messages. The lawyers began to notice surveillance. Their calls began to be intercepted, and personal data suddenly began to spread on the internet. Several anonymous accounts began spreading false rumors that Anna's lawyers were allegedly receiving money from dubious sources and were linked to radical movements. The police and authorities were determined to destroy her reputation and prevent her acquittal at all costs. They needed a showdown to assert their superiority and show everyone that the system was always stronger. But every step they took caused more and more outrage among the people whose support for Anna only grew stronger. Nevertheless, the judges were faced with a dilemma. They could either bow to pressure and convict, risking mass protests and international condemnation, or they could deliver a fair verdict but go against the system. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thickening, confrontation was growing, and each day of the trial became more and more tense. Anna, despite the pressure and long months of imprisonment, refused to back down. At every court hearing, her voice sounded firm, her answers were clear, and she looked judges and prosecutors in the eye without showing fear. She understood perfectly well that her trial was not just a trial of a journalist. It is a fight for the truth and for all those who suffer in silence from a system that no one dared to challenge. Her words and resilience inspired hundreds of people, making her a symbol of the fight for truth and freedom. Meanwhile, protests outside the courtroom continued to grow. People began to gather outside the courthouse for 24-hour actions, burning candles, leaving letters of support and flowers in solidarity with Anna. Some activists organized night marches, carrying lit torches through the city. By morning, the streets were filled with people demanding her release. Each day more and more people came to the square to show their opposition to what was happening. Finally, the police tried to disperse the protesters using force, but their actions only caused an even greater public outcry, and the wave of protests spread throughout the country. Hundreds of people were detained, but this did not stop the protesters. On the contrary, a campaign against police repression began to gain popularity on social networks. Anna's case has now transcended her own story. It has become a symbol of the struggle for truth, for free speech, and against the violence of the system. After a month of prosecution and increased repression against activists in support of Anna, there was an unexpected turn. People who had worked alongside her, as well as individual police officers, unable to withstand the pressure, began to speak out against what they called state lies and falsification. One day, after a regular court hearing, well-known journalists who worked with Anna organized a press conference. Editors of major publications, human rights activists, and public figures came to the conference. On the table in front of them were documents, photographs, and audio recordings that had been the result of joint investigations. Her colleagues spoke out one by one, saying that Anna was a convenient target because her investigations had uncovered serious problems within the police. Secret documents proving abuse and harassment had come to their attention because of her work. These documents are evidence that leaves no doubt. Anna didn't just write, she tried to protect people, one of them said as they raised photos above their heads showing the haggard faces of people who had suffered police brutality. They read testimonies from survivors whose stories were being told publicly for the first time. The journalists described recent threats they had received from anonymous individuals demanding that they stop investigations and withdraw their support for Anna. But the more pressure they were put under, the greater their desire to continue the fight grew. One of her former colleagues spoke out starkly, "We all know who these people are, who are covering up the violence and abuse. The system tries to shut the mouths of anyone who dares to criticize it, but now we will speak louder. Meanwhile, within the police force itself, there were people who could no longer remain silent. A young officer, James Henley, broke an internal taboo and gave an interview for the first time, saying that there was growing discontent within the police force. He revealed that after Anna's arrest, there was discussion inside the station about her article. Some of his colleagues were furious, believing that the journalist had betrayed them, but others, on the other hand, agreed that abuses had become commonplace and had long demanded a response. We all have to work in an environment where loyalty to the system comes first, not justice, Henley said, avoiding looking at the camera. His voice shook, but he continued, knowing this was his chance to make a difference. He described how supervisors repeatedly pressured him and other officers to cover up colleagues' excessive brutality against black citizens. A lot of police officers know what's going on, but they're afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of the threat of their families getting hurt. The system puts pressure on all of us, he admitted. Henley's confession was the first time a police officer had spoken up publicly against his own. Others soon followed. The next day, 2 more officers gave anonymous interviews to corroborate his words. They said there was an unspoken order within the system to ignore complaints, file false reports, and report a stable situation, regardless of the reality of the situation. The emergence of such confessions gave the protests a new impetus. Anger in society was boiling over. People realized that Anna's case was not just about herself, it was about truth and justice, which had become victims of bureaucracy and political manipulation. Now not only human rights defenders and activists began to join the protests, but also ordinary citizens, those who previously did not believe in corruption and police brutality. Protesters took to the streets with placards that now not only called for Anna's release, but also demanded that police abuses be investigated. For the first time in history, in some cities, citizens staged actions outside police stations, demanding answers from officers who cover up the crimes of their colleagues. New slogans emerged: "The system lies, the people suffer. Truth is more important than fear. Freedom for honest police officers." At the protests, speeches were made about the need for reform, the need to protect honest officers who were willing to tell the truth. Resentment began to permeate the officials as well. Some of them began to publicly express doubts about the justice of Anna's case, realizing that their silence only increased anger and discontent. At the regular court session, Anna's lawyers presented evidence collected with the help of fellow journalists. Among them were eyewitness testimonies, photographs and audio recordings that Anna had collected during the months of her investigation. The defense argued that the accusation had no real basis and was instead aimed at intimidation to keep other journalists in fear. The prosecution was lost in their arguments. Each of their arguments was immediately shattered by new evidence. Prosecutors tried to argue that the testimonies and evidence were fake, that they had been bought by activists, but defense lawyers parried by asking them questions about why the police ignored victims' complaints and why they withheld internal reports of arbitrariness. It was now hard to hide the fact that the trial had turned into a confrontation not only between Anna and the police, but also between society and the system. Publications and speeches in support of Anna led to a split that became impossible to ignore. Society was divided into 2 camps. On the one hand, millions of people saw Anna as a symbol of the struggle for truth and justice, necessary to denounce a vicious system. On the other hand, there were those who supported the police, seeing them as defenders of order and stability, and Anna as a provocateur whose actions could lead to chaos. There were actions by both sides in the streets. Anna's supporters gathered with placards demanding her release and police reform. They read her articles, distributed leaflets with quotes from her investigations, and organized rallies in front of government buildings and police stations. The slogan "No truth, no justice" rang out everywhere. Desperation and anger were in the air, and people were ready to do anything to get justice for those who suffered from police brutality. On the other hand, supporters of the police also started organizing actions. People who believe in stability and order believed that journalists and activists were trying to destroy trust in law enforcement agencies, without which society would inevitably fall into chaos. They shouted slogans: "The police is the protector of society. Don't undermine the rule of law." Their columns marched through the central streets, holding flags and national symbols, speaking in support of the police and accusing Anna of trying to undermine the country's security. A furious media campaign began. Some publications published articles revealing the gruesome details of police abuses that Anna was trying to publicize, while others called her actions dangerous agitation and accused her of trying to sow discord in society. Both sides engaged in a fierce battle of words, with journalists and activists calling for reform and stability advocates warning that actions like Anna's could bring the country to the brink of civil conflict. When the protests intensified and the situation in society became critical, politicians intervened. Various parties began to make statements and tried to use the situation to strengthen their positions. Representatives of one party, which supported the police structures, suggested toughening the punishment for defamation of law enforcement agencies and limiting the possibility of journalistic investigations. They accused the activists of inciting interethnic discord and disturbing public order. Opposition politicians, on the other hand, sided with Anna, making strong accusations against the incumbent government and demanding full transparency in the investigation of her case. They organized press conferences calling for a complete reform of police structures to put an end to abuses. However, their initiatives were met with strong opposition from opponents who believed that reforms would undermine the rule of law. Television began broadcasting public debates where activists, Anna's supporters, police officers and politicians met. These discussions quickly turned into heated arguments. The anchors tried to keep participants from being overtly accusatory, but tensions were so high that at times the debates turned into open scandals. Anna's supporters spoke of facts, of documented cases of brutality and discrimination that supported her investigations. They urged society not to turn a blind eye to the violence and demanded justice for all victims. They recounted the horrors that black citizens had to endure on the streets of their own cities and tried to convey that impunity for the authorities was a dangerous precedent that could destroy faith in the state. On the other hand, police defenders insisted that individual cases cannot be taken as a general picture. They argued that most police officers do their duty honestly and accused journalists of exaggeration and attempting to discredit them. You want to destroy trust in the system that protects us. This could lead to riots, anarchy and the breakdown of order, they said, trying to incite fear of chaos in the audience. More and more people in society began to perceive what was happening not as a case of an individual journalist, but as a fight for the future of their country. Social media were flooded with angry posts, threats and accusations. Both sides were polarized. Some saw Anna as a heroine ready to fight for justice, while others saw her as an enemy endangering the security of society. Against the backdrop of the growing division, the protest actions also escalated. Clashes between supporters and opponents of Anna began in the streets of the city. Sometimes peaceful demonstrations turned into riots, and barricades appeared in some places. Police used tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse protesters, which only served to increase anger. Protesters responded by throwing stones at police vehicles and staging acts of defiance. Some of the opposition politicians, seeing the rising tensions, publicly condemned the government for its repressive methods and demanded the immediate intervention of international human rights organizations. But the government took tough measures, announcing a temporary restriction on assemblies, which sparked an even greater wave of outrage. At this time, some high-ranking officials and judges began to express doubts about the fairness of what was happening. It became obvious to some that the situation was getting out of control and could lead to irreparable consequences for the whole country. Several judges even resigned, claiming that they could no longer remain part of a system that prioritized the interests of the government over the interests of the people. This decision only aggravated the split in society and raised a new wave of discontent. People saw that the system was beginning to crack and that not all officials were willing to sacrifice their reputations in order to preserve the repressive order. In the midst of public confrontation, fierce debates and intense protests, the court handed down the long-awaited judgment in Anna's case. The hearings, which turned into a months-long battle, kept the country in constant tension. Politicians, activists, journalists and ordinary citizens waited anxiously to see whether this would be a process of truth or a final blow to freedom of expression and the right to information. At the last court session, the hall was full. Police blocked the entrances and exits for fear of mass protests, and hundreds of people lined up near the court building with placards supporting Anna. Her lawyers debunked all the accusations in their final statement, presenting evidence to prove that Anna's materials were based on real data and testimonies. They insisted that her arrest and charges were an act of political pressure and that not a single word of hers contained slander, but only the truth that the state sought to conceal. After a long deliberation, the judges finally reached a verdict, a guilty plea on some articles related to disturbing the order and disobeying the authorities, but an acquittal on the main charge, defamation of state structures. The judge declared that Anna's materials did not contain malicious intent to undermine state security and that her journalistic activities remained within the scope of the right to freedom of speech. However, she was given a suspended sentence and banned from practicing journalism for 3 years. The courtroom froze. The decision satisfied few. Anna's supporters saw the suspended sentence as a covert attempt to shut her up, while her opponents thought the punishment was too lenient. The crowd outside the court buzzed. Someone shouted, "This is not justice," and some raised a banner saying "Freedom for journalism." Clashes broke out nearby, and the police again used force to disperse the crowd. The court decision, although it allowed Anna to go free, was a huge blow to journalism. There was fear among her colleagues, if even a well-known journalist with a reputation like Anna's could be subjected to reprisals. What about others? Editorial offices began to downsize their investigative departments, trying to avoid topics that might provoke a negative reaction from the authorities. Several independent publications closed down, and journalists with many years of experience resigned, explaining that they could not work in an atmosphere of fear and pressure. Nevertheless, the court decision triggered a wave of protests and insubordination among young journalists. They started to create alternative platforms, publish anonymous materials and share information in closed networks. Social media were flooded with hashtags in support of freedom of expression, and hundreds of journalists across the country organized protests demanding full protection of the right to independent reporting. One of the loudest protests was the action organized by young journalists in front of the headquarters of the largest national newspaper. They unfurled a huge banner with Anna's image and under the slogan "Truth is stronger than repression" demanded protection for those who report on injustice and abuse. Soon international organizations paid attention to Anna's case. A number of human rights foundations and journalist unions expressed concern about the repressive methods of the state and called on the authorities to respect freedom of the press. Organizations such as Amnesty International and the Committee to Protect Journalists issued reports condemning her case as an example of harassment of journalists and pressure on freedom of expression. This international outcry had political repercussions. Several countries terminated bilateral agreements with the local government, expressing dissatisfaction with its policies. But Anna's case became not only a symbol of repression, but also a catalyst for a global debate about the future of journalism. Media outlets around the world began to take a closer look at state structures, exposing corruption and brutality. Anna's story inspired hundreds of journalists who saw her case not just as a fight against arbitrary rule, but as a call for a new wave of responsible journalism. Despite her release, Anna returned to a life that would never be the same again. Her name became a symbol, but also a stigma. Her reputation as a fighter for the truth made her the object of constant surveillance and threats. She was subjected to constant surveillance. Her loved ones were under pressure, and all her contacts became closely monitored. Anna faced restrictions on her every move. She could no longer officially work in journalism, and many of her friends and colleagues cut off contact with her because of fears for her safety. But she wasn't about to stop. In the privacy of her home, Anna began writing a book about her experiences, documenting every court hearing, every interview, every instance of pressure on her and her team. This book would be her last weapon in the fight for the truth. Anna realized that her story went far beyond a single investigation. Her case became a battle for freedom of speech and the right to fair reporting. Anna's story, arrested for trying to tell the truth about police abuse and racism, was not just an event, but a powerful catalyst for change. Her investigation, public support and trial left an indelible mark that forced the system, the government and society itself to rethink its position. At first it seemed that the authorities had succeeded in suppressing her voice, but in the long run the consequences of her case were deeper and wider than anyone could have imagined. After Anna's release and the international scandal, pressure on law enforcement agencies increased to an unprecedented level. Public demands for police reform, supported by journalists and human rights activists alike, became louder and louder. People demanded the dismissal of high-ranking officials believed to have been involved in covering up police abuses and a review of policies on human rights standards. The government, unable to withstand the pressure, announced the establishment of an independent commission to investigate incidents such as those Anna had tried to uncover. The commission, made up of lawyers, journalists, members of the public and former police officers, was authorized to access cases previously classified for reasons of state security. Over the course of 2 years, the commission audited hundreds of complaints of abuse of power and uncovered numerous cases of police officers abusing their power by covering up crimes and using violence. The results of the commission's work became the basis for major reforms in the police. It was made mandatory for officers to wear body cameras on their uniforms while on duty, so that their every action would be monitored. Additional penalties were imposed for uncovering and confirming cases of police violence and discrimination, and massive vetting and purges were carried out among officers. These changes were a direct consequence of Anna's case and her journalistic investigation. Another important outcome was the adoption of new legislation protecting journalists and their right to work with information related to state structures. The laws include articles aimed at protecting journalists from unjustified harassment and measures to prevent pressure on them from the authorities. Anna became a symbol of the struggle for journalists' rights, and her name made headlines in laws that aim to protect the press and ensure transparency in the work of government agencies. Now, the arrest of a journalist because of his investigative work would be considered a direct violation of human rights, with consequences not only for the officials responsible for such arrests, but also for the entire reputation of the government. The government was forced to make these changes because Anna's case attracted the attention of international organizations. She won numerous awards for her courage, and her name became a symbol of resilience in the face of repression. Anna's story generated a new level of civic engagement and forced society to take a new look at the need to control the authorities. In major cities, public councils emerged to monitor the actions of the police and their interaction with citizens. Online platforms were created to collect complaints and information on cases of abuse, helping victims of violence and abuse to get support and attention for their stories. There was a growing sense among citizens that the truth had power, that their voices could be heard. Anna's example inspired many to fight for justice, and people were no longer afraid to speak out about their experiences and demand change. There was a demand for honesty and transparency in society, and it was no longer easy to ignore and cover up cases of violence by the law. Inspired by Anna, journalists across the country began to return to topics they had previously considered too dangerous. They realized that they now had more legal protection and that the public was ready to support them. Many young reporters and activists saw her story as proof that even one voice can change the system. A new wave of investigative journalism aimed at exposing corruption, abuse, and human rights abuses began. Anna's contribution to the cause of independent journalism was significant. She became a symbol of struggle that could no longer be ignored. Publishers, previously wary of publishing such material, saw her story as an example of how the truth, despite all threats, was supported by the people. Journalists began to unite, forming trade unions and human rights organizations to protect themselves from possible attacks and to support each other. Anna, years after the trial, continued to live in seclusion, knowing that her journey to the truth had cost her much. She could no longer return to her old life, but her work had changed society, and she saw the results of that struggle. She remained in people's memories as a symbol of resilience, as an example that the struggle for justice requires sacrifice but can change the system. When her book came out, detailing her experiences, her life under investigation, and the cost of fighting for the truth, it was instantly sold out in bookstores. In the book, Anna spoke of her hopes for the future, for a society where everyone can speak the truth safely and openly. Her story has become part of journalism and human rights textbooks. Anna left a legacy that made young journalists remember to fight for integrity and citizens remember that they can influence the actions of their authorities. Through her writings, the distinct and unquenchable light of truth shone on the shadow of injustice and cruelty, changing the country forever. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.